Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We now move on to verse 21 of surah Baqarah. Ya ayyuha al-nas, abadu rabbukum, alladhi khalaqakum, waladhina min qablikum, la'allakum tattaqun. O mankind, serve or worship your Lord, the one who created you and those before you, so that you may tattaqun, which we can translate as that you may protect yourself, defend yourself, save yourself. Alladhi ja'ala lakum al-ard firashan wal sammaa bina'an wa anzala min al-sammai ma'an فَأَخْرَجَ بِهِ مِنْ الثَّمَرَاتِ رِزْقًا لَكُمْ فَلَا تَجْعَلُوا لِلَّهِ أَنْدَادًا وَأَنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ. The one who made for you the earth a resting place, and the sky a canopy, and sent down from the sky water, then brought forth with it, or thereby, of the fruits, or some of the fruits, a provision for you. So do not set up for God rivals while you know. So we just concluded in the previous passage, we just concluded a long description of the kafirin and munafiqin, those who reject the truth, cover up the truth, are ungrateful to God, and the hypocrites, those who pretend to be believers but are not really. So they're basically kafirin as well. And you remember that the surah begins with a kind of description of the book before us, of the Qur'an, and sort of list of the characteristics of a believer, or more specifically, the people for whom this book is a guidance. So in this verse 21, we have a transition to a new kind of passage, and it's, I think, the first direct address to mankind and to the reader. So that's Ya ayyuha al-nas. That's a kind of direct address, O mankind. And it's also a direct command. What should you do? In a nutshell, what you should do is Abadu rabbakum, serve your Lord. So there's not any ambiguity as to what the basic command of the Qur'an is to its readers. Obviously, you can spend a lifetime, and probably should, searching into the details of what the Qur'an asks of us. But at the same time, and this is, of course, part of the beauty of this book and part of the sort of miracle of how it works, it also can be summed up very quickly in a way that a child can understand. And that's important because, of course, children also need to be taught the Qur'an. So in a very simple form, the command of this book is serve your Lord, worship your Lord. And of course, we have to talk about what that entails, but that is what it is in a rough sense. And I think we can read into this sentence, as we read the rest of the sentence, a kind of logic for why this is our duty, why it is imperative that we worship our Lord. Because, of course, the sentence continues, the one who created you and those before you. And then it goes on. But so, the obvious question might be, well, why should I serve my Lord? Why is that so important? And the simple answer is because you would not exist without him. He created you, as well as your entire species, those before you. It's very easy, I think, let me rephrase that. One of the challenges of the Qur'an, of reading the Qur'an, is to linger over these passages, which we think we know what they mean. And in a sense, we do know what they mean. I know what it means to say that God created me. But that's not the same as actually registering the significance and really feeling, emotionally and spiritually feeling the reality of the fact that I am a created being, that I owe my existence to something, someone other than me. We tend, I think, and of course this can vary from culture to culture and from person to person, but generally human beings tend to think of themselves as autonomous, as independent. And consequently, we also think of ourselves as not owing anyone anything. Or if we do owe people things, it's only in proportion to what they have given us. Like I owe my parents this much because they were this nice to me, but my parents weren't that nice to me, so I don't really owe them too much. That kind of thing. But the idea of owing your very existence, and therefore owing everything, literally everything, from, the fact that you just are, to the fact that you can breathe, the fact that you have health, if you have any health whatsoever, any kind of good health, that you have food, etc., that you owe all of that to God, and that therefore you are not a free agent, that you can't measure how much you owe to God and then pay off that debt and then move on the way that you maybe could, that you can really with other humans, that they gave you a certain thing and you owe them a certain thing in return, that's proportional. There's no way of measuring, as the Quran tells us, there's no way of counting up God's blessings, God's favors, God's gifts to human beings, to ourselves. And so there's no way of paying it off, which doesn't mean that we're not obligated to constantly try to. But the point I'm trying to make is that we are therefore not autonomous, according to the Quran. We're not free agents. And so in the very strong language of the Quran, we are not only required to serve God, to worship God, but we're slaves of God, abd Allah. And this verb, or the command here, is abadu, which is same root as abd, a slave. So we're supposed to be slaves of God. And as we'll find in other verses, while there are different uses of that word abd, a lot of the time, all human beings are described as abd Allah, like we're all God's slaves, whether we like it or not, whether we're kafirs or not, or believers. But at other times, it's spoken of as something that we can choose to do, that we can choose to follow this command and be slaves of God, or we can sort of disobey that command. But the point is that there is a sense in which we're all God's slaves, whether we like it or not. It's part of human nature that we are created beings, not autonomous, not free to do whatever we want, and hence slaves. And again, this bears repeating that that's not how we like to think of ourselves. And again, this is not true of just any one culture. Just human beings generally want to feel that we are not slaves, that we're each unique and each independent and have our own kind of adventures to pursue. And that's not all wrong. but obviously it's partly wrong. Okay, so then the verse concludes by saying, kind of giving a rationale for why we should follow this command, or a kind of motivation. It says, serve your Lord, the one who created you and those before you, la'allakum tatakun, so that you may defend yourself, so that you may save yourself, so that you may be saved. And of course, the standard translation is that you may become righteous, but I'm trying to go for the more literal translation. So using taqwa as a word meaning protection, defense, or maybe in a grander sense, salvation. So why do we do this? So that we don't go to hell. It's very simple, right? So that we can protect ourselves from the worst outcome, which is to be sent to hell. So there's no real choice given here. We either will serve God and be saved, protect ourselves, or don't serve him and be damned. So the next verse goes into further detail about our debt to God. He created us and he created those before you, but also he is the one who made for you the earth a resting place, and the sky a canopy, and sent down from the sky water, then brought forth thereby, meaning with that water, he brought forth of the fruits as a provision for you. So do not set up for God rivals while you know. So this verse elaborates on that very brief verse we just read, by both giving us further details about our debt to God, what he has done for us, and also giving us some sense of what it would mean to serve God. Because that last part of the verse is telling us that part of what it means is not having any other competitor, any other rival who's competing for our worship, our adoration. No one besides God. So to be a slave of God is to be only God's slave and no one, and not to serve anyone else. As for the details about what else we owe to God, and these are further elaborated on in several other places in the Qur'an, and I want to talk about one other place in a moment, inshallah. These details are helpful. As I said a moment ago, part of the challenge of the Qur'an is to linger over and to make sure that we really register the significance of what we're reading, and not just kind of take it for granted and say, well, yeah, it's true, and then move on. Yep, God created me. And the reason why I find this verse helpful is that it doesn't just say God made the earth and he made the sky, but he's explaining that the nature of the earth and the nature of the sky, the way that they were designed, is explicitly calculated to be pleasing to humans, to be useful to humans. The earth is a resting place. The sky is a canopy. And anyone who knows even just a little bit of science knows that this is true, of course, that the sky is a canopy or a protective layer, or rather really a set of layers. And as other passages say, there are 7 heavens or 7 layers to this sama, the sky, which is scientifically quite accurate as far as we know. And then the earth being a resting place. I mean, there are other descriptions elsewhere that kind of elaborate on this, that talk about the earth being an expanse, that it's smooth, that in other words, kind of level. So it's a place where it is possible to live, to build, to grow food, and all of these things. And then sent down from the sky water. and of course by that means brought forth fruits, food, as provision for you. So, of course, this is a direct contradiction of the atheist view and the kind of 20th and 21st century view that human beings are not at the center of the earth or the center of the universe. That's called the anthropocentrism, the idea that humans are at the center of things and that things are designed with them in mind. But Qur'an is telling us, actually, the earth and the sky and even things like the stars way outside of our galaxy were designed with human beings in mind. Doesn't mean that other creatures and other life forms are not important. We don't know too much about what God has in mind for them, which makes sense, right? This is a book sent to humans, so it's going to talk mostly about us. But what we do know from the Qur'an is that the earth was designed, setting aside what other purposes it might be serving, it's there to serve us. And other passages get even more emphatic about this by saying that God subjected the sun and the moon to human beings, and subjected other things as well, I believe. They're our subjects. They're there to serve us, not, of course, in the benighted sense that some people have, that everything's just there for us to use however we please. There are rules to follow in how we use the earth, and the Qur'an will talk about those, and also talk about people that break those rules. But in short, God has designed this for us. So again, it's trying to get us not to take the earth for granted, or the sky for granted, or water for granted, and realize that not only are these things wonderful, it's not enough to just say they're wonderful or I'm grateful for them, but to realize that they're specifically designed for us, and to think about what that would mean in terms of how much investment God has put into human beings, each and every one of us, and how significant our lives are, but also how much pressure there is on each of us to serve God and thereby to pay off this debt. And to use that language again, to defend ourselves from the punishment that will be the fate of anyone who doesn't pay off this debt. A couple of vocabulary terms, or at least one that should be talked about here, is the word rizq, and that's what's translated as provision. So God sent down from the sky water, then brought forth thereby of the fruits as provision, or rizqan, or rizq, for you. This term is very important, and it appears throughout the Qur'an. One thing that's worth noting is that it's not always referring to material things. There's a key passage in Surah Maryam, and it might be in other places as well, but there's a description of Maryam, the mother of Jesus, where she's described as receiving rizq from her Lord in this way that was very mysterious. And when Zechariah, who was kind of her guardian, would enter the prayer chamber and find her presumably praying there, he would find that she had received rizq from her Lord, and he asked her, where did you get this from? And she said, it's from my Lord. And there's a standard interpretation of that passage that it's referring to food, which I'm following other commentators in thinking that's not the correct interpretation, that it's referring rather to she received instruction, wisdom, learning from her Lord, which for a number of reasons makes more sense. I guess I won't go on at length about that because we're not talking about that verse right now, but it's worth mentioning in passing because that word rizq will appear again, and it is referring to a broader way in which God provides for human beings. Although I guess in this passage it's more a material kind of provision. Okay, so now we'll move on to the next verse. Wa in kuntum fi raybin mimma nazalna ala abdina fatu bisuratin min mislihi wa da'u shuhada'ukum min duni Allah in kuntum swadikin. And if you are in doubt about what we have sent down to our slave, there's that word again, abdina, abd, slave, and naz, our, so abdina, our slave, then produce a surah, or we can say chapter, a surah like it, or from its like, from a book like it, and call your witnesses other than God, if you are truthful, swadikin. Fa'in lam tafalu, walan tafalu, fataku al-nar, aladi wakuduha al-nas wal-hijarat, uiddat lil-kafirin. But if not you do, and never you will do, then defend yourself, fataku, from the fire, whose fuel is men and stones prepared for the kafirin, for those who reject the truth. Okay, so this pair of verses is an interesting kind of, I don't want to say digression, but it changes tack a little bit, and addresses specifically people who question this book that we are reading. And it gives a challenge, and we'll see this challenge issued in other places as well. And the challenge is simply this. If you don't believe that this book is God's, authored by God, that it's the word of God, then produce a piece of writing like it, or specifically produce a surah from the like of it. So it doesn't have to be a book, just part of a book that resembles this one. And call your witnesses other than God if you are truthful. And then it goes on to say, but if you do not do so, and you won't be able to do so, it's not possible, then you should be afraid. You should fear, or that's the standard translation, but literally defend yourself from the fire whose fuel is men and stones. So hell. Prepared for the kafirin. I don't know how much commentary is needed here. It's kind of, the meaning seems pretty clear. It seems like one of those verses that can be thought of in historical context, right? That if we think about the first listeners to this book, and they were, a lot of them, but again, not that different from today, but they were saying, well, this is just written by a human being. It was invented. Muhammad just came up with it, or maybe he's someone else, some learned person is kind of whispering into his ear and he's just repeating what he's being told to say. But so God, from very early on, is responding to those challenges with a challenge of his own. And it's an interesting reply that, okay, well, if you don't think this is real, if you think this is made up, then why is it, and this is the implication, I think, why is it that no one can mimic it? Why is it that no one can produce just a surah? And some of these surahs are just a couple verses long, a few verses long. So it wouldn't have to be a lot. But somehow it's inimitable. It cannot be imitated. The other thing to say in this context is God obviously is not interested in proving that the Qur'an is real. He's interested as far as we can tell, in providing, as he says, a guidance for those who are seeking guidance, for those who are muttaqin, trying to defend themselves. If his goal were to convince all of humankind, well, he obviously could do that, as many verses say. If God wanted to, he could guide all mankind. He could send down verses to which their necks would bend in humility. We read in other passages. That's not what he's doing here. The Qur'an is a guidance for those who have passed certain tests to deserve guidance from it. We have other verses where it even says that it will actually increase bad people in their kufr, or in their rejection of the truth. It'll make them worse. So it's not supposed to be some kind of magic bullet. And so that's why, and I mention this here because whenever I encounter people discussing the Qur'an, whether they're questioning it or defending it and trying to say that it's true, and trying to persuade other people this is really the book of God, I always feel that there's something, the premises on which these discussions are based are flawed. For instance, when people will try to either disprove or prove the veracity of the Qur'an by pointing to its scientific inaccuracy or its scientific accuracy. It's not really our job to prove that the Qur'an is true. And I don't think it would be effective if someone disbelieves in the Qur'an. They're not going to be convinced because one verse happens to be unaccountably prescient in anticipating some scientific discovery. And I don't doubt that you could find such verses, and that can be interesting. I'm not saying it's not worthwhile up to a point, but our goal should not be to prove. Our goal is not to convince people. And then we are told that again and again, that if people don't believe, your job is only clear conveyance. That's what we read again and again, just to convey, just to relay the message of the Qur'an. It's not to add anything to it that will make it more persuasive than it already is. So anyway, I guess my point here is God himself is not condescending to or deigning to convince people. It's not his goal. He's just saying, well, if you really think that this is fake, then why don't you fake it? Make a replica of it. Moving on to verse 25. وَبَشِّرِ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ أَنَّ لَهُمْ جَنَّاتٍ تَجْرِي مِنْ تَحْتِهَا الْأَنْهَارُ كُلَّمَا رُزِقُوا مِنْهَا مِنْ ثَمَرَاتٍ رِزْقًا قَالُوا هَذَا الَّذِي رُزِقْنَا مِنْ قَبْلُ وَأُتُوا بِهِ مُتَشَابِهًا وَلَهُمْ فِيهَا أَزْوَاجٌ مُطَهَّرَاتٌ وَهُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. And give good news to those who believe, or those who have believed, and do al-swalihat, which here is translated righteous deeds. It's a major term which we'll have to talk about, but so they do deeds that are pleasing to God, swalihat. That for them are gardens, flow from beneath them rivers. Every time they are provided, and here's the word rizq again, ruziku, from it, of fruit, as provision, rizqan, they say, this is that which we were provided before. And they are given in resemblance, or they're given things that resemble what they previously received on earth. And for them, in it are spouses purified, and they in it abide. The phrase Alladina amanu wa amilu as-salihat appears throughout the Quran, and that's kind of the standard phrase for describing and kind of naming the believers, those who believe and who do al-swalihat, as I said, deeds that are pleasing to God. Of course, we would want to inquire into the exact meaning of this phrase, since it's describing what we want to be, right? We want to be believers. A couple of things to mention. Amanu, I'm pretty sure, is in the past tense. So while it's typically translated those who believe, really those who believe will be alladhina yu'minun. And we see that elsewhere. We saw it earlier in Baqarah, which says this is a guidance for those who yu'minun bil Rabb, believe in the invisible. That's present tense when you add that y-u at the beginning. But here it's amanu, which is past tense. So a literal translation would be those who believed, or those who have believed. And I think the significance of that is that to remind us that belief is not something that can be, it's kind of what you might call an iterative process, something that needs to be repeated constantly. So if you are really someone who believes in the present tense, it means that at this very moment you are doing something, even if it's just a matter of how you're thinking or feeling, you're doing something to earn that status as someone who believes. You're doing something that reflects your belief. Whereas those who have believed, or those who believed, is, I think, possibly a weaker description, meaning it's talking about people who maybe are not right now believing, but at least they have believed in the past. They have made some kind of efforts to follow the guidance that Muhammad, or whomever the messenger might be, has brought down. And so they've made a profession of belief. And in fact, Ishra Ahmed likes to translate this as, when it says like, "O you who believe," he says it should be, "O you who profess to believe." So it's a profession. Whether or not we follow through on that profession with actions and words, etc., is uncertain. Which of course makes sense, because if we were guaranteed to be believers, and that's a kind of permanent status, then there wouldn't be any reason for us to be continually striving, right? And continually studying the Qur'an and trying to further our knowledge of God, or belief in God. There's uncertainty in our status. And then those who believe in Amilu al-swalihat, and this is also, I believe, in past tense. So they might not be doing swalihat in the present, but they at least have begun. They've tried to get onto the path of doing swalihat. So the word swalihat, standard translation is righteous deeds. Well, whenever I see the word righteous, I always think this is too vague, because it's just like saying good. But good in what sense? And what does the Arabic word mean exactly? And to the best of my ability right now, I can say, at its root, we have the three letters swad, lam, and ha. So swali. So in its like root form, you have swali. And the research I did into that word, just using the kind of famous Lane's Arabic English lexicon, told me that it has to do with things like preserving things in their original and their proper form. So swali is a kind of preservation, a kind of proper usage, I think. And it's the opposite of fasad, which we've seen elsewhere, where it's the kafirs or the munafiqeen are accused of spreading corruption, tufsidun, of spreading fasad. And that would be corruption, right? So when things lose their original proper shape or condition, they are said to be corrupted. So the opposite of that is to keep them as they are. So, and I think that's interesting. I mean, I'm not going to claim that that's exactly what we should be thinking when we see Amilu al-Swalihat. But I think that it bears remembering that root meaning, that when we see Amilu al-Swalihat, it can mean to do things in such a way that we're preserving the sort of correct state of things, whatever the things might be. So if you think, for instance, about family, someone who in their relations with family members, they act in such a way that those relations are kept as God wants them to be kept, right? So a relation between a husband and a wife, obviously, first thing would be no adultery, not even approaching adultery, says another verse. So that would be a kind of preservation, that God has created affection between husband and wife, and he's created this very important legal and social bond between them. And in order to preserve what God has made in that relationship, you have to take certain actions and avoid certain actions. And to do that is a kind of swalihat. This is partly guesswork on my part, but I think this is accurate, I hope. A broader understanding of the term here would be just to act in such a way that is pleasing to God. And this is not based on the literal meaning of swali, but I think just in keeping with what the Qur'an says elsewhere. Our goal is to obey God, to act in such a way that we are not seeking our own satisfaction, but instead seeking God's pleasure, seeking God's approval. And I think that's, probably roughly what is intended by the translation righteous deeds, but it gets a little more specific. But it's one of these phrases that I think it's sometimes just easiest to just say the Arabic term and just try to keep in mind the connotations of that Arabic word, which maybe is not translatable in any satisfactory way. So these people we're supposed to give good news. That's part of the instruction. Because remember, I said that in this passage, starting at verse 21, we have the first direct commands to the reader. And the first command is to abadu rabbakum, serve your Lord. And now the second command is give good news to the believers. Wa bashir. Bashir means give good news. So it's interesting that that's the second command. You wouldn't think of that perhaps as the second most important thing. And I'm not saying it is it's not necessarily the case that God is arranging these in order of importance, although we can infer that abadu rabbakum is the most important. Serve your Lord. That's kind of covers everything. But in any case, the second one that's mentioned here is tell people that you're going to go to heaven if you believe in God and do swalihat, do deeds that are pleasing to Him. And we're going to find that in the Quran, it is hugely important to say to other people what the Quran says. So we're all kind of tasked with that responsibility of being messengers of a kind. Not saying we can lay claim to the status of being a messenger, but our job is to relay this information. I guess part of the sort of journey to understanding the Quran is figuring out just how important a role God has assigned to each of us who are readers of the Quran, that we actually have to put the work of not just understanding, but also also communicating the Quran to other people. We have to put that work at the center of our lives as far as possible. Okay. And then there's a very interesting description of heaven. I won't go into too much detail here, but it's talking about how rivers flow beneath it. There are gardens and rivers flow beneath them, which of course is not just acknowledging that there's an abundance of water, but also I think indicating the lushness of these gardens, that they're continually being watered. They don't need even rainwater. There's rivers watering them. And then what's fascinating here is that the connection that the passage draws between this garden, or rather these gardens, plural, in heaven and the fruits that we have on earth. And this is a very important concept because it's kind of indicating, or at least hinting to us, what is the significance of the deliciousness of fruit, something as seemingly as simple as that. And God is hinting to us that, why does fruit taste so good? Why is fruit kind of occupy our imaginations to quite an extent? And it's because we can infer that it's supposed to give us some kind of preview of what heaven is like. So much so that when we get to heaven, if we get to heaven and we taste the fruit there, we'll remark upon the similarity between this fruit and what we had in this life. And in fact, God goes on and says, they will be given things in resemblance, mutashabihan. So the things that we experience, if we're lucky enough to go there, in heaven, it's described as resembling what we've experienced already. So it's giving us some indication, I think, of the importance, really, of sense experience, and also of something which I think is important, which is trying to make sense of the bounties that God gives at least some human beings. I think that especially for people that are trying to be serious about the truth and about ethics, it often can seem arbitrary or meaningless to enjoy things like fruit, food, or beauty, the beauty of nature, gardens, things like that. And you see this a lot in, like, for instance, like communism, that, rather than worry about these kind of luxuries, we should just make sure everyone has enough food. And what here this passage suggests is that, well, there is a way of experiencing these kinds of good things that is meaningful and that contributes to our efforts to seek the truth and to live ethical lives. Does not mean, of course, that we should be, spending all our money on the most luxurious fruits and trying to build, gardens for ourselves. But it does mean that if God gives us things to enjoy, I don't think we should just kind of look down on the enjoyment of those things as something that only kafirs do. And meanwhile, we should just be kind of suffering in solidarity with, say, the Palestinian people who don't get to enjoy such things. That's probably a great impulse. But of course, as we learn elsewhere in the Qur'an, we have to be careful about not saying this is forbidden when God has not said it's forbidden. And more generally, not kind of imposing on ourselves sacrifices and sort of penances or sort of ascetic practices that God has not himself imposed on us. So in any case, what is the purpose of fruit, for instance? Well, this passage indicates, again, that it's partly to give us a preview of heaven and to, I guess, encourage that impulse that we have to work towards going to heaven. Because again, as this verse says at the very beginning, we're supposed to be giving people good news. And of course, we ourselves should also be receiving the good news that there is a heaven, that it will entail endless happiness and pleasure. And so the pleasure that we experience in this life, however brief, however sort of flawed, is part of that good news, I guess. Part of that good news that God is capable of making these things, of giving us these things. And even though he will not give us them in abundance and in an uninterrupted manner in this life, if we go to heaven, he will give us them in that way. So I'm going to leave off there.